Hello everyone, so this presentation will be about how the conditions in big cities in America was not the greatest and how that connects to monopolies, how that connects to the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, and how that connects to other safety issues of the modern times. Now, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a lot of migration into cities, and going from all of this to this was a pretty big change. It was no small change at all. Now, there actually was not very much competition in cities because what would happen is all these companies would, be open, and then they would get successful, so they'd buy another company out, like one of their competitors, and then eventually there's just no competition, and government regulation of monopolies didn't really exist back then, so they were allowed to do it. Now, in cities, the living conditions were not exactly the greatest, especially you can see in this picture right here. Um, you can see they're really crammed in there. So, yeah, and then the working conditions weren't really the best either. Like in this picture right here, they were probably really hot. So, yeah, not exactly the greatest conditions if you're poor, and lot of people in the working class were really poor. Now, one of the main reasons for city conditions being so bad was actually because of monopolies, because when you have a monopoly, you can literally basically do whatever you want because workers don't really have a choice and customers don't really have a choice. So, like, you can raise prices high, you can pay people very little, you can, you know, make conditions not the best. You can make it dangerous. You don't really have any safety precautions because those didn't exist either. Um, and yeah, you can pretty much do whatever you want. Workers were desperate to take whatever job they could take, so the owners were getting more and more rich as they buy more and more small businesses, and then the working class becomes more and more poor as they don't really have much of a choice for work. These monopolies didn't just affect the conditions of living, it also affected worker safety because, again, there was no government regulation. So, safety precautions usually cost money, and companies were all about profit. They wanted to do whatever they could to maximize profit. So, they saved money wherever they could. Like, they weren't going to stop workers from working just to do a fire drill or something. They didn't want to do that. Now, progressives knew that the monopolies were part of the problem, and workers also tried to protest because they wanted to have better conditions, but the problem is protesting back then wasn't always safe. You could either get fired or you could even get arrested. And sometimes you have to go back to your job with no change at all, so it didn't always even work. And you could get fired for even simply being in a union. Companies were very powerful since they were monopolies, so they could ignore workers' demands, and even if you were believed to be in a union, they would fire you. Now, when you have a system or anything that just doesn't really work, it will eventually be exposed and something will go wrong that will make people really demand change. So in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City caught on fire. So for some background, it was definitely not the safest building to be working in. The workers weren't really treated well. You were really crammed in there. And they were really focused on efficiency. So like you couldn't even leave to use the restroom. Like you were locked in while you were working. And that was definitely not safe. But again, they didn't really care about safety back then. Here's some more pictures here. They were definitely crammed in, and you were expected to be there at a certain time. You all left at the same time. You were expected to make a certain amount of products for the day. Everyone was held to a really high standard. So this fire, it spread really fast, and like I said, the workers were locked in, so they couldn't really escape that way. And then also the fire escape, it would have taken hours for everyone to get out using the fire escape, and they did not have hours. They only had like a couple minutes. People died from jumping out of windows, jumping into the elevator shaft, or just simply being burned by the fire. This fire still shouldn't have spread in the first place, because there actually was one fire protocol, and that was 3 water buckets that could have been splashed on it, but all 3 of the buckets were empty, so the fire spread. Now, most workers did know that working in there was dangerous, but again, they really didn't have much of a choice. They really needed that money, especially because a lot of those people were immigrants who came into New York, so they really needed the money. This fire pretty much destroyed everything. Like, everything's gone. It's just piles of rubbish and stuff. So after this, progressives as well as the family members of the people who died all started protesting because they were upset. They didn't think this should be even allowed to happen. They felt it was prison conditions in the workplace. The owners knew what they were doing, and that they didn't feel that in a first world country this should be allowed to happen. People wanted fire precautions, and a lot of people even felt that you should not go back to work until fire precautions are in place, such as fire extinguishers and fire drills. Now, this wasn't even the only fire. A year before, there was also a fire in Newark, which is near New York City, and protesters used this for their case. They said, this needs to stop. There were some politicians who did agree with the progressives, such as Theodore Roosevelt, and change was enacted and there was reform in New York City. But this event shows what happens when there's no government involvement and companies are allowed to do whatever they want. So activists did make change. There was a factory investigation commission that was created, and they helped pass laws to prevent stuff like that from happening. Workplaces started to be investigated, and also new safety laws were invented. So that's how fire drills and sprinkler systems and even regulated working hours were implemented. So this disaster, as well as the progressive movement, helped not only push safety laws, but it also helps push labor laws. So it goes back to progressives wanting to go to the root of the problem of cities as well as the class divide, which it all started with monopolies. Now, companies actually did end up becoming interested and caring about keeping workers safe. So especially because they could be sued, and they didn't want to be responsible. They wanted to keep their image good, and employees actively look for hazards and dangers and look at how can they prevent them. Safety is actually now even promoted. People really do want to keep employees as well as customers safe. Now, companies are not always right. They still sometimes get things wrong, and they are still discovering new ways to keep people safe. So overall, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory disaster is still a big deal to this day, because it's a reminder of what happens if there's no government interaction and companies can do anything they want. And it's also a reminder of what happens when owners put profit before the safety of employees and customers.